The Miccosukee Indian Reservation Resort and Convention Center in Dade County is almost always packed. The high tourist season brings plenty of visitors who come for the airboat tours of the Everglades and the swanky facilities that have great food, spas, and all sorts of entertainments. And in the off-season, the place is booked to the brim with conventions and end-of-year functions. November 2007 was at the time of year when Miami is at its quietest. The summer winds down, and there's just enough heat left to still get a good look at some of the fantastic wildlife in the swamps. This is a time when the tourists are gone, and the Miami natives make use of their beautiful surroundings just before the dry season kicks into full gear. Miccosukee had two functions going on that day. One was an engineering convention, and the other was a farewell for some big-shot Wall Street-type executives. The day was looking like it was going to be a busy one, but not more than usual. The crowd was made up of academics and older business types, all wearing lanyards to get them access to their various seating arrangements and sleeping quarters. This rather boring crowd was exactly what they needed after the chaotic back-to-back events that they had hosted in the past 3 months. The lack of activity might have been a relief for Miccosukee, but not so much for the underbelly of Miami. The two car thieves prowling the parking lot were getting desperate. High season brought plenty of pockets to pick on overcrowded streets, and more than enough cars were accidentally left unlocked by distracted tourists. So Heriberto Rubio and Justo Padron turned to the resorts and hiking trails to fund their criminal careers. Today, they weren't after pocket change. They were looking for cars that still had their keys in the ignition or hidden under seats. If they could get a car out of the lot, they'd have it stripped and the parts sold off before the end of the day. Both men were well into their 30s, and this was how they'd gotten by since their teens. Neither Heriberto nor Justo wanted anything to do with the violent crime sector. At least, this version of criminality was violence-free and low-risk, and the people they targeted were almost certain to have car insurance anyway, so they didn't feel too guilty about the thievery that was about to take place. The two slinked behind bushes all morning, only coming out when the parking lot emptied completely. They found 2 unlocked cars and stole a few electronics and some money in the glove compartments, but neither of the vehicles had any keys in them. But they weren't deterred. Someone was bound to come along and leave a set behind, so they waited patiently for the right opportunity to arrive. Unbeknownst to them, they'd left the door to one of the cars that they'd targeted slightly ajar, an expensive sedan that held a laptop and some banknotes that they hid in the bushes where they were hidden. The owner of the vehicle broke away from the engineering convention to retrieve his computer, only to discover the open door and the missing laptop. He alerted the resort manager of the theft, and the staff immediately contacted authorities. While the furious engineer waited in the reception area for police, Heriberto and Justo were already back in the lot. Unaware of the police, Heriberto continued searching unlocked cars and finally found a car with its keys still in the ignition. He called Justo just as he was getting in on the driver's side, and the 2 police cars pulled in behind them. Justo saw them first, and after yelling a quick warning to his companion, he sprinted into the brush. But Heriberto was stuck. One of the patrol cars was parked right behind him, and 2 officers descended on the man who had already started the car. In a desperate final attempt to get away, Heriberto reversed, hoping to get out, but he hit the police car behind him, and before he could even think of going forward, he was pulled out of his seat and wrestled to the ground. Meanwhile, the other patrol car saw Justo streaking off into the wilderness, and the 2 officers jumped out in pursuit. The ground was uneven, and the overgrowth left them plenty of traps to trip over. Justo was as quick and limber as he had been when he was a teenager. He sidestepped and jumped over any obstacles with sure feet and at a breakneck speed. The officers were in great shape, but they were no match for the barefoot thief who moved as fast as lightning ahead of them. Justo cleared the patch of growth in seconds, leaving the policemen blundering around behind him. Ahead of him was a lake that was fed by a small river, and beyond that was the resort fence line. If he could get to the fence, Justo was as good as gone. There was no way they could catch up with him once he was out in the open swamp. Luckily, Justo was as good a swimmer as he was at running. Without breaking his speed, he dove into the murky water gracefully. The staff and resort-goers had spilled out onto the lawn to catch a glimpse of the spectacle playing out on the grounds. One man was being handcuffed and stuffed into a dented patrol car, and the other was leading a spectacular chase that ended with a splash. The two officers in pursuit were already winded, and Justo was clearly going to win this race. But the staff of Miccosukee were horrified at the sight of the agile man streaking past them. They knew better than anyone how dangerous that water was. The resort was home to a very large alligator, which the employees playfully named Pancho. Pancho basked in the sun on the banks almost every morning, and he never paid any mind to the people. The lake was covered in signs warning everyone not to swim there due to the alligator presence. But obviously, Justo hadn't noticed any of these signs with all of his attention on his flight from the cops. The waitresses and groundskeepers yelled at him in a mix of Spanish and English, screaming that there was a gator on the other side of the lake. Pancho woke up from his slumber in the sun. All of the commotion was not at all what he had in mind this afternoon. The predator scanned the crowd and then the lake. To its surprise, there was a human swimming past him. This was unprecedented. Never before had humans ever come even close to its domain, and certainly not alone in the water. Pancho didn't need telling twice. The person swimming past him was a meal, practically gift wrap for him to take. Pancho slipped into the cool, dark lake, propelling itself with its tail so fast that not even Justo could outswim it, no matter how good of a swimmer he was. The crowd was hysterical, and some of the braver men even went to the very edge of the pond to get Justo's attention. The two police officers came to a halt where Justo had dived in. Even they started yelling for the man to get out, but Justo was deaf to their screams. The only sound in his ears was the rushing water and his heartbeat beating in his skull. And every time his head came up for air, he only had eyes for the fence line that promised freedom. He was halfway across the lake now, pumping his arms like he'd never done before. Justo was oblivious to the danger closing in on him, and the crowd stood horrified, watching the reptilian hunter sink into the water, swim toward the man, and finally, they saw the beast reach the thief and pull him smoothly and soundlessly under the water. Taken completely by surprise, Justo felt the heavy, scaled body close over his back, twisting around him as it wound Justo into its coils. The horrifying realization of what was happening hit Justo just as the gator started spinning him in its drowning death roll. But it was too late now. He was securely trapped, and his head was turned upside down while water flooded into his mouth. Justo grabbed desperately at the hard scales, trying with all of his might to pull and push the animal off him. But his efforts were useless. It was like clawing at rocks, and Pancho didn't slow down its spinning or react in any way to the man's struggles. Round and round he was thrown, screaming soundless bubbles as the animal pulled him deeper and deeper into the dark. The gator didn't waste time spinning his prey on the surface of the water like they normally do. With all the screaming and yelling from the shore, it dove deep under the water to finish the kill without any humans interfering from the surface. As it turned in circles, it squeezed its body tighter around the man. Justo felt his ribs shatter into his already waterlogged lungs. The lake water he'd inhaled was now joined with blood. The immense pressure and the unbearable pain started to fade away as he lost consciousness. He was already passed out when the creature latched onto him, landed at the bottom of the lake. It kept lying there, 50 feet below the surface, until it felt Justo's heartbeat stop. Only when it was absolutely sure that the man was dead did it release its hold. The alligator quickly repositioned its grip on Justo and swam him to a more secure location where it could feed in peace. On the lake's banks, more help had already been called, and Heriberto was driven away in handcuffs. From the back of the patrol car, he'd heard the commotion, and he was able to put together the pieces about what was happening. He was horrified and helpless to do anything about Justo's predicament, and Heriberto knew he was never going to see the man he'd known since they were teenagers. Diving teams and more police cars arrived as Heriberto was driven out of the parking lot to the nearest jail. The ride was almost completely silent, broken only by the officers giving him their condolences. Even they found the entire affair hard to absorb. Later that night, the same two officers visited Heriberto in his cell to inform him that his friend's remains had been found, that the alligator responsible for his death had been killed, and that any remains still left in its stomach had been recovered and placed with its owner. Unfortunately, Heriberto wasn't able to attend the funeral alongside his friend's family. He had no one to bail him out while he awaited his court date. So Heriberto was forced to sit on his cot on the day he knew Justo was being put into the ground, left with only his thoughts and regrets. The Miccosukee Indian Reservation never allowed another predator to make its home on the property again. If an alligator was spotted for more than 2 days in a row, they'd chase it back into the swamp where it belonged. Pancho was the last gator they ever tolerated after that day, fearing someone else would meet the same terrifying final affliction. Christopher Allen Whiteley had tried to get on the straight and narrow, but had spent most of his adult life in prison and addicted to methamphetamine. However, after a 5-year jail term spent in Billy Moore Correctional Center in Overton, Texas, things were finally looking up for him. He landed 2 jobs, one working in an Odessa oil field job and another painting houses. After being released in June, he had worked hard during the summer of 2020, saving up enough money to buy a car. He secured it for $500, a Chevy Blazer, which he intended on learning to drive that year. But Christopher would never learn to drive. Just as things were beginning to go right for him, they suddenly went badly wrong. Incarcerated for crimes such as aggravated assault, it could be assumed that he had some enemies out there. So when his body was found in some dense woodland, there were some serious questions to be answered. Who or what was to blame? It all began on December 2nd, 2020. At 28 years old, Christopher was heading to his house painting job in Fort Worth, Texas. That morning, he left his girlfriend's home in Lippon, an hour's drive away from Fort Worth. He planned to hitchhike to the city, but he never made it. Something terrible happened between Lippon and Fort Worth that day, but it wasn't until the next evening that his friend filed a missing persons case. The county sheriff's department began a search for the young man. He hadn't been spotted on the road, and it was assumed that he had taken a shortcut between his girlfriend's house and the main road, where he had planned on thumbing a lift from. The shortcut was through an area of dense woodland. As officers scoured the trees and underbrush, it was tough going. There was initially no sign of human activity, but after a thorough search, they stumbled across Christopher's blue and white backpack. Moments later, they found Christopher's body. He was shirtless despite the cold weather, and he was slumped in some very dense scrub a few yards from his backpack. His throat had been cut open from one ear to the other. He had narrow scratch marks over his torso, face, and head. There was a huge amount of dried blood at the scene that had poured from his open neck wound. Immediately, deputies surmised that Christopher had been killed by a mountain lion, but animal experts were convinced this was not the case. Mountain lion attacks in Texas are unheard of, and sightings are incredibly rare. However, only the week before, a mountain lion was spotted near downtown Dallas. Could this have been the culprit in Christopher's death? Mike Bodenchuk, an experienced mountain lion trapper and director of Wildlife Services Texas, was called in to help with the investigation. His findings suggested that this was no mountain lion. Typically, mountain lions stalk their prey from behind. When they are within pouncing distance, they launch themselves onto the back of their prey. They use their long, sharp claws to latch onto the animal's flesh whilst delivering a fatal bite to the throat. The victim dies through asphyxiation. A mountain lion attack can be determined by not only the injuries sustained by the deceased, but also the telltale signs left behind by the cat. There were no puncture marks on Christopher's body where the mountain lion would have latched on with its claws. he had not been asphyxiated by powerful jaws crushing his windpipe. Instead, his arteries in his neck had been torn open and he had bled to death, and the scratch marks on his body were superficial, made by something a lot less powerful or a lot smaller than a big cat. None of these pointed towards a mountain lion. Furthermore, there are usually distinctive signs left behind by these wild cats. There was no disturbed vegetation, which often happens when a mountain lion makes a kill. There were no broken twigs or scuffed up dirt from a struggle between predator and prey. There were no drag marks to the dense bush where Christopher lay. His body had not been cached and hidden by the mountain lion to return to later, which is typical for these cats. His organs were intact, something mountain lions tend to devour first. In fact, none of him had been eaten at all. There were no feces found at the site, something which mountain lions leave behind to mark their cache, and there were no territorial scrapings in the form of mounds of vegetation, often marked with urine, either. The ground all around where Christopher lay was sandy soil. Investigators left behind footprints whilst they tried to determine exactly what happened, but there were no paw prints left behind of a mountain lion. There were, however, footprints of significance when all others left by investigators were discarded. Mike Bodenchuk began his investigation by working from the kill site outwards. This is when he spotted the unusual footprints, something that had been missed by the law enforcement team. Leading to the spot were two sets of human footprints, but leading away was only one set. The slick-soled cowboy boots Christopher wore that day accounted for one set, but the others were made of heavy tread soles. Could Christopher's death have been a homicide? Was the owner of the shoes responsible? Investigators dismissed these findings, claiming that the other set of footprints could have been made by a landowner simply checking on his cattle. Walkers frequented the woods as well. It was impossible to determine that these footprints belonged to someone who witnessed what happened to Christopher. But they weren't the only set of interest to Mike Bodenchuk. He was now convinced that a mountain lion was not responsible for the attack, and although he suspected homicide, he also claimed that it could have been another animal that attacked Christopher. Footprints of coyotes, deer, hogs, house cats, and dogs were found near the scene. Of these footprints, he was most interested in those made by a dog. They were from a medium-sized hound, one such as a pit bull. There was a possibility that this was a rogue dog that had unexpectedly attacked Christopher. The severity of the sliced-open throat could have been accounted for by a dog such as a pit bull, but it could also have been from a dog that was deliberately commanded to set upon Christopher, perhaps from one of his enemies, perhaps from the person with the thick tread soles. But even being attacked by a dog was questionable. Although pit bulls are capable of killing people, they do not take them down to the ground without a fight. There were no bite marks on Christopher's arms to suggest he fought off an aggressive dog before being floored by the animal. Medical examiners concluded that Christopher was indeed standing up when he was first attacked. Although he had some methamphetamine in his system, they did not believe that he was sitting or lying on the ground in a semi-conscious state when he was killed. Evidence suggests that he fell to the ground and then possibly crawled into the dense bush as he bled out. Remarkably, the medical examiners never took any DNA samples from Christopher's body. His fingernails were sent for analysis to determine whether there was any mountain lion DNA in them. The results came back negative. Those who believe that a big cat certainly was not responsible for the 28-year-old's death couldn't understand why the lead inspectors weren't investigating the case further. Significant leads came up, and there were so many unanswered questions like, why was Christopher shirtless in freezing conditions? Whose footprints led away from the crime scene? Why was his body washed before taking valuable DNA samples? His friends and family believe that the sheriff's department didn't want to waste any more time and resources on trying to track down an ex-con's killer. They settled on the conclusion that an animal killed Christopher and closed the case. For those who knew and loved Christopher, it was incredibly frustrating and heartbreaking not getting the answers they so desperately needed. Wildlife expert Mike Bodenchuk placed wildlife cameras at the site, hoping to catch the culprit, but the only animals to show up on it were cows, deer, hogs, and a bobcat. Although he is not a law enforcement expert, Mike believes that another person was involved in Christopher's death, whether intentionally or not. It could have been a case of not being able to control their dog and leaving the crime scene without reporting it. Or it could have been a deliberate act. Although the case is officially closed for Christopher's loved ones, it very much remains open. We may never know what truly happened to Christopher Whiteley, resulting in his mysterious final affliction. At one point, the alligator skin trade had the gators in Florida down to a meager 100. Trappers and traders made a killing, so to speak, off the booming trade. When their numbers became critically low and heavy fines and laws were placed around hunting them, the trade almost stopped completely. Yes, the gators were saved, but the efforts were more successful than anyone could have predicted. Today, Florida has well over 1 million alligators in its waters, and with that huge jump in numbers comes a huge jump in the number of attacks recorded around the Everglades, too. The area around Lakeland Canal in Florida is huge, with plenty of hidey holes for criminals to do their deals in private, and even more places for teenagers to go to do some underage drinking without being discovered. Florida is a wild place, both for the animals and the crowd of people looking for a good time. The 17th of May, 2008, was a Saturday, and a group of teenagers and college students had congregated in one of those secluded places we just mentioned. It started off innocently enough, a group of around 20 kids hanging around a small pond in the afternoon with illegally bought booze. They had inflated tubes, and the party was still going strong by the time the sun started to go down. The pretty girls and plenty of free drinks brought in dozens of other kids. By the time the evening had settled in completely, the group had swelled to more than 50. The cars supplied plenty of light, and someone even had a pretty good sound system in his car, playing the hits of the day. Just a little after 9 p.m., the party was in full swing. If you asked any of the youngsters there that day how many of the partygoers they were actually acquainted with, they would tell you that they didn't know half of the people there, and a lot of them weren't in much of a state to tell who anyone was anymore anyway. There was one young man in the crowd that no one really took notice of. He was around 21, and he'd hopped in a car with a group of young men he just met at a bar a few hours ago with the promise of a party and some pretty girls. One moment they were chatting over the counter, and the next he was at a pond where he didn't know anyone. The 3 college students that had given him a ride hadn't even bothered to catch his name. But that was all right. He didn't know their names either. The unnamed young man didn't stand out since many of the kids weren't acquainted with each other before that day, and he talked comfortably with almost everyone at some point or another during the evening. He moved between the groups of friends clustered together, making small talk for a few minutes before moving on to the next group. Like all young people seemed to do so comfortably, the conversation flowed easily between strangers, and even if they didn't know someone before that day, you made friends fast enough over football teams and pop culture. Somewhere, the young always seem to find common ground when they're thrown together. Katy Perry's I Kissed a Girl just ended, and it switched over to Leona Lewis's Bleeding Love, when the laughter and music were interrupted by the telltale wail of a police siren. In a matter of seconds, before the patrol car headlights even fell on the scene, the music winked into silence. Bodies practically trampled over each other, and hordes of kids piled themselves into the nearest vehicle they could reach. The cars dispersed like a huddle of raccoons caught in the trash can. They just scattered into the night. The cops were lucky enough to pull over 2 cars, one of which had 8 people crammed into it. 12 of the more than 50 partygoers slept in jail cells that night until their parents could come and bail them out the next morning. But that unnamed man was not lucky enough to make it into one of the cars. When the sirens went off and the party dispersed, he was on the farthest side of the clearing. He'd just come back after relieving himself behind some bushes nearby, and it was quicker and safer to just jump behind the nearest tree than it was to run all the way across the clearing. He was never going to make it all the way to the nearest car before the cops arrived, so he decided to hide instead. But with only the dim light of the fire, he misjudged his step completely and crashed into the pond. With all of the stomping feet, the sirens, and the general chaos of the moment, no one took notice of the startled yelp he let out or the sound of the splash as he hit the water. It wasn't deep, just cold and muddy. He came up almost as soon as he went under, but he didn't move from the cold pond. Instead, he lay deathly still, hidden from sight by reeds and bushes. 2 police officers jumped out of the patrol car and rounded up the kids in the 2 cars that were too slow to make it out. Another patrol car raced off, hoping to catch some of the other teenagers that were fast enough to hit the dirt road. If it had still been light out, the officers would have easily spotted the young man, soaked to the bone, hiding in the shallow water. But the darkness kept him well hidden as long as he lay very, very quietly. Unbeknownst to him, there was another danger just behind him, and this one did not come with handcuffs and a gun. This one had scales and teeth. A 7-foot alligator had been stalking the pond almost all afternoon. Initially, she had her sights set on waiting for one of the partygoers to venture into the water alone, but they kept coming in to cool off in groups of 3 and 4. She had her teeth and immense strength, but she wasn't much bigger than the humans. She knew full well that she wouldn't get away with a kill if she had to fight off several of them at once. When the night came, the humans stopped going into the water, and she was just about to leave, giving up her chances of catching anything that day. But in that moment, the police arrived, and the young man fell into the water. She observed that he wasn't moving, so she inched a little closer. But there was so much movement on the banks that she was very careful to make her approach. By the time the teenagers were rounded up and the officers had them lined up and waiting for backup to arrive, she was only 4 feet away from him. She could smell the mammalian heat radiating from his body, and she had to fight all of her instincts to not jump on him right then and there. After waiting so long, she needed to approach this hunt just right if she wanted to eat at all that day. Quietly, the lad lay and watched as 2 more cars pulled up and marched the miserable teenagers into the back seats, cramming them in like sardines in a can. And even more quietly behind him, the stalker closed in even more. The gator was only 2 feet away from him now. The cars backed out, and before their headlights had even disappeared completely, the man pushed himself up from his stomach, gearing to get out of the pond. That's when the animal struck, when she saw that the boy was about to get up and out of her hunting ground. She sank her teeth into his leg, pulling him in the moment she had him in her grasp. It came out of nowhere, with his eyes on the receding patrol cars and his knees under him already. The man had no warning, no inkling of what was coming. He just felt the sharp pain suddenly shooting through his leg, and the enormous heave that threw his face down into the 3-inch water. He kicked out his free leg, screaming bloody murder into the night, and felt his foot connect with something hard. That's when the reality of the situation hit him. This was an alligator, and it was pulling him away from the bank. If the drunk teenagers in the back of the patrol cars weren't bickering and yelling at each other, someone might have heard him scream. The man kicked and wiggled his body desperately, but it was no use. The creature had him away from the bank and in the open water in a matter of seconds. In that moment of panic, all traces of inebriation left him. He kicked, screamed, and swallowed pond muck, fighting the brute strength of the animal that had him in its grasp. The teeth tore through his jeans and ripped through the muscle and skin beneath the fabric. But the man no longer had any ground beneath him, just empty water. This is where the predator was most comfortable, in the deep. Instinctually, she whipped her tail and body around him, spinning as she went. She was so fast that she created a whirlpool as they descended into the dark. The young man was wound so tight that his collarbones smashed into each other. Now completely entwined and fully submerged, there was no longer any way to fight the beast. His arms were pinned to his sides, and his free leg kicked feebly as the world around him spun at dizzying speeds. Even if she didn't have him by the leg, the death roll itself was enough to incapacitate him completely. It didn't take long for the young man to sink into unconsciousness. Lack of air was only part of it. The animal's body, coiled around him, was so tight that it cut off circulation. There was no oxygen coming in from his lungs or his blood. His brain was deprived of oxygen in mere seconds. He was as good as dead the moment she had him in the open water. When he went still, the alligator unwound her reptilian hold on him. Without letting go of his leg, she swam him off into the connecting stream that fed into the pond. The place she decided to stow him so that she could feed in peace. Before the morning came, no less than 4 other alligators were attracted by the smell of blood, and it didn't take them long to find them. For hours, she fought the scavengers away from her kill, and not all that successfully. The first loss was the man's shredded leg, grabbed up by a smaller gator when her attention was on another. She fought off the one that had her occupied, but it was too late to stop the thief from getting away with the leg. She did manage to get the whole leg that was still attached herself, but only just in time before 2 more gators showed up. These ones were much larger than she was, and they shoved her out of the way to grab what limbs they could reach. In a grotesque tug-of-war, each gator had an arm in its mouth. It didn't take them long to each get away with a piece. Luckily, they were happy with the arms they got, and they disappeared into the early morning light with their stolen breakfast. And there, on that riverbank, is where 2 fishermen found the gator later that morning, still fighting away a small congregation of younger alligators that collected around her. The authorities were there within minutes of receiving the call, but it wasn't going to be a simple extraction. The female was maddened by anger. Her kill had been repeatedly snatched up piece by piece, and by now, she'd been fighting for almost 12 hours. She was out of her mind with rage. No amount of noise could chase her away from the corpse, and she snapped and stormed at anyone and any boat that dared approach her. It took 3 shots to kill the enraged animal, and several more to disperse the collection of alligators that milled around the area. At the end of the day, 4 gators were dragged out, the female among them, but only she had any remains inside her stomach. The other 3 weren't lucky enough to get away with a scrap. This posed a huge problem for the authorities. The young man had no arms, and therefore no fingerprints that could be extracted from the remains. His head was still intact, but barely. The night's fight, with several animals involved, had left such a ruined mess behind that he was no longer recognizable by his facial features. The rest of his remains, too, were scratched, torn, and ripped, so even if he'd had any tattoos, they were now no longer identifiable. The only thing they could do was take DNA from his teeth and hair and put it in storage. And that's where those samples are to this day, gathering dust at the back of a storage facility almost 20 years later. John Doe was never identified. No one knows where he came from or who his family were. And after so many years, it's unlikely that we'll be able to put a name on the unmarked grave that stands in a graveyard in Florida. His identity will forever be a mystery, unlike the story of his terrifying final affliction. In February 2018, under cover of darkness, a trio of poachers made their way across the South African border from Mozambique. Their destination was one of the private game reserves along the edge of the infamous Kruger National Park. It was pitch black, and they tripped and stumbled through the undergrowth as they made their way towards the wilderness. They didn't use any form of light, as they wanted to go unnoticed, but they had made this journey before. They knew the way. Living in the remote village of Mavudza in the Mesengiri area, a lot of the people lived a poor existence. 3/4 of the population is illiterate, but most survive through farming. Fields of corn, cassava, cowpea, peanut, sweet potato, and rice provide a meager income for families and food on the table. Houses are set amongst Mozambique's sandy soils and surrounded by agricultural land. Only 4% of the houses in the region have access to electricity, with little in the way of future prospects. 50-year-old David Baloyi was no stranger to this temptation and, along with 2 others, trekked into South Africa on February 9, 2018. They sneaked into the Umbabat Game Reserve, just south of the Olifants River that flows through Kruger National Park and into Mozambique. They carried little with them, only a handful of butchery tools and 2 .456 Winchester hunting rifles. They were on the lookout for big game. These weapons could take down the likes of elephant, rhino, and lion. The illegal trade in big cat products, rhino horn, and elephant tusks are huge commodities in China and the Far East. They can fetch thousands of dollars, and although the poachers themselves only see a small fraction of that price, it can make a difference to their livelihoods. They rely on this income to feed their families. Rhino horn is more valuable than gold on the black market. Poachers risk life and limb poaching prized animals. With poaching patrols stepping up across South Africa and many other African nations, poachers can catch a bullet from armed rangers. In neighboring Eswatini, they have a shoot-to-kill policy when it comes to poachers. But sometimes, it's the animals themselves that poachers are most in danger from. Usually, poachers hunt for their game during a full moon. This helps them to see better and means that they don't need to use a flashlight, which can be picked up by rangers on patrols. They typically hunt in threes. One will shoot the animal, the other will cut off the body part they are after, and the third will keep watch. Nobody knows for sure which animals David and his 2 companions were after, but when they crossed into the private game reserve that night, only 2 of them would make it back out alive. Stealthily, they stalked through the bush. Their arms were scraped by the long acacia thorns protruding from the trees. Their footsteps were quiet upon the dusty, dry earth. Their hearts beat quickly as the adrenaline of the nighttime hunt began to kick in. Flicking on their flashlights for only a few seconds at a time, they found a trail, perhaps the telltale paw prints of a lion. Crouching down low to the ground, they paused and strained their eyes in the darkness. They whispered to each other, each of them listening to the sounds of the African night. But they weren't the only ones out hunting in the darkness. The 3 Mozambican men may have been carrying deadly hunting rifles, but there was something out there that was far deadlier. With thousands of years of natural killing instinct packed into a powerful body, the African lion is responsible for an estimated 200 human fatalities each year. Male lions can grow to almost 10 feet or 3 meters long, including their tail, and can weigh almost 500 pounds or 225 kilograms. In some individuals, the canines can be as much as 4 inches or 10 centimeters long. They are generalist predators, eating a wide variety of prey species from wildebeest and zebras to gemsbok, giraffe, and buffalo. Although lions do hunt during daylight hours, they mostly rely on the cover of darkness to take down prey. Like most nocturnal animals, they possess a tapetum lucidum in their eyes, which reflects more light back through the retina, helping them to see in low light. Their night vision is 6 to 8 times better than a human's. In the dark, lions definitely have the upper hand or paw. As the men crept forwards, so too did a pride of lions. David wouldn't have heard the lionesses approaching, but it seems the 3 of them walked straight towards an approaching pride. With no time to react, David suddenly let out a loud cry as he was knocked off his feet. He squeezed the trigger of his gun as something huge grabbed his head. The sound of the gunshot echoed across the African bush, alerting rangers far and wide. David could feel the canines sinking into his skull, and he screamed as he struggled to pull his head free. He kicked his legs and thrashed around as the immense power of the lionesses pinned him to the ground. Amongst the commotion, the other 2 men dropped their weapons and sprinted off in the opposite direction. David had been only feet in front of them when he was attacked. They had seen the murky outlines of several large animals diving on top of him. They heard the struggle, the moans and groans of the lions, and the screams and cries of their friend. Sheer terror gripped them as they fled, running back through the game reserve. They tripped over fallen branches and crashed through the bush. They didn't look back. Their hearts thundered in their ears as they tore through the African night. Gasping and panting, they made it to the perimeter fence and crawled through. Only once they were on the other side of the wire did they stop to catch their breath. It was a 50-mile hike back to their village. When they arrived, they had to deliver the devastating news to David's family. David had been left at the mercy of the lions. He was easy prey. His friends had abandoned him. With no way of seeing the lions in front of him, he could have walked straight into the middle of the pride. He couldn't defend himself, and it would have taken just seconds before one of the lionesses closed her jaws around his throat. Asphyxiation and exsanguination are how lions subdue their prey, and David was no exception. It wasn't a territorial attack. The lions were out on the hunt that night. They were looking for a meal. Whilst David's friends made it out alive, he was devoured by the pride of lions. The gunshots were heard by rangers who headed to the area, but when they finally located the scene of the hunt, the lions had scarpered. All that was left of David was his head. Almost his entire body had been eaten. The alarm had been sounded, and police and paramedics arrived on scene when daylight broke. David's remains were transported to Mafuta Malati Hospital mortuary. When his family learned of the tragedy from the two others on the hunt, they phoned David's sister-in-law. She lived in South Africa, and so was the closest family member to where he now lay. She agreed to formally identify him. It must have been traumatizing for her to see him like that, but she confirmed his identity, and the family were able to grieve their loss. Lieutenant Colonel Moachi Nagopi of South African Police Service was trying to piece together exactly what happened. Nobody from David's village was talking. Nobody confirmed whether the trio had been out poaching that night or not. Instead, the evidence needed to be gathered. Next to David's body lay the hunting rifles and a large amount of ammunition. These weapons indicated they were out looking for big game. There were 2 sets of footprints leading away from the scene, suggesting the other 2 sprinted away, given the length of the strides. Some may say that David got what he deserved. With so few tigers left, there is a higher demand for the use of lion bones in Asian tiger cake and wine. Anti-poaching patrols in South Africa often come across the corpses of lions. Their faces and paws have been hacked off, destined for a shipment to the Far East. Coming across such gruesome discoveries is so common now that the rangers and anti-poaching units no longer become emotional by what they see. There are now more elephants than lions in southern Africa, and their numbers are declining at a rapid rate. Habitat destruction and loss of prey from the bush meat trade, as well as conflict with farmers, are also leading to their demise on top of the ever-growing poaching problem. As long as poaching continues, thousands more animals will die, and some of the poachers will meet their terrifying final affliction. It was the 13th of November, 2015, and Matthew Riggins was up to no good. He had turned to a life of crime to survive on his own in Palm Bay, Florida. And on this particular night, the 22-year-old told his girlfriend that he was heading to Barefoot Bay to burgle some properties there. He anticipated he would be out most of the night, collecting his haul from several of the houses in the area. He would likely be back in the early hours of the following morning. He knew what to do, and he knew what to expect. But this time, things were different. This time, he hadn't anticipated the obstacles that stood in his way. Not just law enforcement and eagle-eyed locals, but an apex predator out on the hunt in the darkness. He met up with one of his friends, his accomplice, and the two of them headed to Barefoot Bay, a 20 minutes drive away. This is a residential community located in Brevard County, Florida. It is situated along the eastern coast of the state. This residential area is a popular destination for retirees. Many Americans and Canadians have holiday homes there, which they visit during the cold winter months that occur further north. The warm tropical climate of Florida offers a relaxing break from these harsh winters. Late that night, Matthew and his friend worked covertly to scout out the best properties to burgle. They dressed in black, kept their voices low, and watched for movement inside the homes within the community. But the two men weren't stealthy enough, and they were spotted by a number of residents. It was late, and their behavior was suspicious as they walked up and down the streets dressed in all black. As they walked up and down Tequesta Drive, sheriffs received emergency calls about the pair. Locals said the men were acting suspiciously and thought they were likely to be burglars. Officers were immediately dispatched to the community, and they turned up at the scene at around 2 a.m. There had been previous burglaries in the area, and they were intent on catching these two suspects. A helicopter was deployed to Barefoot Bay, along with the police canine unit on the ground to track the men down. Sweeping through the neighborhood, officers spotted the two suspects on Royal Palm Boulevard. Realizing the police were onto them, the two men fled. It was easier if they went their separate ways to avoid capture, and the pair split. Whilst on the run, Matthew found a dark corner and hunkered down. He took out his phone and called his girlfriend. He was sure he was going to get caught. He let her know that he was being chased, that the dogs were onto him, and that he may not make it back to her that night. He told her that he would lay low for a little while until the heat of the chase had died down. That was the last time she spoke to Matthew. In an attempt to throw the dogs off his scent, Matthew headed for the water. It was a large lake known to locals as Barefoot Bay Pond, but most bodies of fresh water in Florida are known to be home to alligators. There are said to be 1.3 million alligators in Florida, and they reside in each and every county within the state. Visitors enter the water at their own risk, but in the heat of the chase, it's probably the last thing Matthew would have thought about as he decided to jump into the shallows. He had made a fatal error. As flashlights scanned the nearby streets and alleyways, Matthew scurried down the banks surrounding the pond and waded into the water. He felt the coolness engulf his legs, sending a shiver through his body. He crouched down behind some vegetation. His eyes were wide as he peered through the darkness, back towards the houses. His heart was racing, the adrenaline from the chase coursing through his body. Hiding in the water was his best shot at not getting caught by the police. The sniffer dogs would lose his scent. No one would guess to look for him in the water. But he was in even more danger now than before. A silent predator lay only feet from where Matthew crouched down. He hadn't noticed it in the darkness. Only nostrils and two gleaming eyes would be seen above the waterline, its tail propelling its body under the surface. Matthew was oblivious to the imminent attack. An alligator can detect its prey in murky waters or under the cover of darkness. It uses sensitive pressure sensors on its snout to detect vibrations in the water. These touch sensors, which center around their face and jaws, are more sensitive than human fingertips. They allow the animal to hone in on its prey with precision and high accuracy. This particular alligator measured 11 feet, or 3.4 meters long. Within seconds of Matthew entering the water, the alligator moved in for the kill. It grabbed the young man by his legs and pulled him from the shallows. Matthew cried out in pain, at first thinking it was a police dog. He scrambled to try and pull himself out of the water, but the reptile was too strong. Officers on the chase heard his desperate cries, but they couldn't locate them in the darkness, and they didn't know who they belonged to. As Matthew fought to stay above water, he grew weaker. The alligator had closed its jaws around his legs with a bite force of over 2,000 psi. There was no way Matthew was getting out of its vice-like grip, and he was dragged underwater. His lungs were bursting, his body was fading, and less than a few minutes later, he was dead. The alligator pulled Matthew's limp body through the water. Alligators are opportunistic hunters. They typically consume prey that they can eat with one bite. Birds, fish, turtles, and small mammals such as muskrats and kopu are typical prey, but they can also take down deer and occasionally black bears. For larger prey, they usually attack by holding onto the animal and taking it underwater. They will perform a death roll, tearing off bite-sized chunks. Officers didn't catch either man that night, and when Matthew failed to return home, His family grew worried. They reported him missing later that day. However, it wasn't until 10 days later that Matthew's body was spotted floating in the murky waters of the pond. It had been severely mauled and partially eaten. It was missing its lower extremities and one arm. Next to Matthew's body was an incredibly aggressive alligator. It tried to attack divers when they approached, threatening them with its jaws wide open. It had made its kill, and now it was defending its catch. When officials reported the aggressive alligator, Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission were called to the scene. Considering the danger the alligator posed to the public, they had no choice but to euthanize it. They brought in an expert trapper to capture the alligator and to kill it. They knew they had caught the right alligator. When they opened the alligator up, they found human remains consistent with Matthew's injuries, including a single hand and a foot. It is thought that Matthew drowned before being partially eaten by the animal. This is what alligators do with large prey. Matthew's accomplice and friend, who was with him that night, was caught by police and questioned. He refused to cooperate with officers and couldn't provide any further details into Matthew's tragic demise out of fear it would link him to the burglaries. He was released without charge. Over the last 10 years, Florida has averaged 8 unprovoked bites per year that are serious enough to require professional medical treatment. Countless pets have fallen victim to the gators in Florida as well. Some may say that what happened to Matthew was karma for his crimes, while others will say that no one deserves to experience such a terrifying final affliction. Our story today takes place in Yellowstone National Park, but we will go back in time to the year 1912, where the way of life in the park was starkly different to that of today's life. With constant fluctuations in the wildlife population, 40% of the lakes in the park were barren of fish, creating widespread problems for the people in the area, but also for the wildlife, which began to starve. Eventually, something had to be done, as the people became desperate, and so there was a 2-story fish hatchery built in 1912, which helped to replenish the area again. In turn, this increased the local population of bears, as they were now able to find food more readily available. As a result, many populations had a sudden increase, namely the grizzly bear numbers, which was not too much of a problem, as there weren't too many people in the area, and encounters were still very unlikely. That is, until a bear known as Two Toes became a man-eater and changed the locals' perspective on bears forever. In May 1912, Johnny Graham decided to visit Crevice Mountain with his favorite horse in the hope of striking gold and finally making a family fortune. Suddenly, his horse tripped in a creek and fell onto her side. Johnny realized that she was struggling to return to her feet and tried to pull her up with her reins with little success. She was able to pull herself from the creek to the bankside, but she had broken her leg and so would not be capable of continuing with the hike. He decided it would be better to put her out of her misery instead of leaving her to die, and so with his hunting rifle, he shot her through the head. He took one last look at his steed, gathered up his things, and returned to his cabin for the night, trying to decide what his next move would be without his horse. After a few days of prospecting the area on foot, he returned to his cabin to see the dead body of his horse being slowly devoured by a giant grizzly bear. He watched the animal through the willow trees, trying to determine its condition and how much a threat it would likely pose to him. As he watched the animal, he noticed that he was a very healthy male bear and knew that he wouldn't have much of a chance if it decided to attack. So instead, decided he would set a trap for the animal. The heavy steel trap was designed with thick, jagged teeth, perfect to clamp onto the animal's leg and hold him in place until Johnny could return and shoot him. It was not the most humane device and would certainly cause the animal incredible distress, but this was not a concern of the prospector. Once the bear was full and sauntered away from the corpse, Johnny placed a 60-pound bear trap nearby in the hopes of trapping the animal in the coming days. This would not go according to plan. He returned the next day to check if the bear had been caught or not, but to his bewilderment, the trap was gone. He didn't understand how this was possible and came up with 3 possible scenarios. 1, there was another person out in the wilderness who had stolen his device, although this was highly unlikely as he hadn't seen anyone in days. 2, the bear had gotten caught in the device and pulled himself free in the bushes, although he couldn't see any blood anywhere. Or 3, the bear still had the device attached to him and was wandering around in extreme pain. Johnny surveyed the area and found footprints of the bear leading into the forest. He followed them and suddenly found the animal trapped between 2 trees, with the trap creating a wedge that he couldn't escape from. Johnny was overjoyed as he could tell the animal was trapped and wouldn't be able to get him. He slowly lined up his rifle with the bear's chest as the target. He fired 2 shots into the animal's ribs, and with a loud roar, the bear fell to the floor and ceased to move. Confident that his shots had killed him, Johnny strode towards the animal and laid his rifle against a nearby tree, ready to begin skinning the body for a rug in his cabin. As he stood in front of the body, the bear suddenly sprang to life and pounced at the man, and before he could even process what was happening, the bear was ripping him to pieces. Through its agony, the animal had one last bout of adrenaline and decided to use it against his killer in a final act of revenge. He pulled his leg through the trap, ripping off 3 of his toes in the process, but he didn't care. Once free from the trap, he started tearing into Johnny's abdomen and forced him into the ground as he screamed for help, cursing his decision to leave the rifle behind. The bear soon decided to flee after his mauling, leaving Johnny bleeding out but alive. 3 years later, in June 1922, an outlaw known as Frenchie was setting traps along the creek to catch anything he could and sell it back in town. Trapping was illegal without a license, but this didn't matter too much to Frenchie. He was already on the run for various different crimes in different states at the time. One day he realized that his trap line had caught something big, but he had to return home in order to kill it. He saw the animal from afar, a giant grizzly bear struggling in the creek. Frenchie ran back to his cabin and grabbed his hunting rifle. He returned at nightfall, but he couldn't see the bear. Somehow, he had escaped from the man's trap and was now roaming loose. His location was not a mystery for long, as he was swiftly attacked by the same bear that he had trapped. But this time, he would not win. Frenchie's rifle was found nearby a few days later as his wife sent out for help in finding her husband. His body was never found, but from his rifle, his death was assumed to be brutal. It is thought that the bear was able to swat the rifle from the man's hands as he pulled the trigger, allowing the bear to overpower him easily and finish the job. They believed this due to his rifle being bent, as if something heavy had struck it. Two Toes was never seen or heard from again, although the trap in which he was caught in was found a year later. Ultimately, Two Toes was never seen from again after finishing his rampage with a confirmed kill count of 3 men, although it was speculated to have a body count much higher. There was multiple missing persons in Yellowstone during the time who were also believed to be the victim of Two Toes, but without any bodies being found, it can never be confirmed. In the years that followed, the legend of the deadly Two Toes continued to haunt the local prospectors and trappers. Every brave soul who dared step into the wilderness couldn't help but feel a shiver down their spine, frightened with the anticipation that they might soon come face to face with the murderous bear and meet their terrifying final affliction.